Imagine waking up one morning feeling perfectly fine. You eat breakfast with your family, you kiss your wife, you ruffle your children's hair. You walk to work, nodding to your neighbors along the way. By afternoon, you feel a slight headache, a nagging ache in your joints. By nightfall, you are burning with fever. By the next morning, you cannot breathe. Your lips are turning blue. By the day after that, you are dead. This was not a nightmare. This was not a horror story invented by some fearful author dreaming up monsters under the bed. This was the daily reality of life in the United States of America in the autumn of 1918. A reality that unfolded in cities from Philadelphia to San Francisco, from the frozen plains of Kansas to the crowded tenements of New York City, from the naval yards of Boston to the ancient pueblos of New Mexico. This was the Spanish flu, and it was the single most catastrophic biological event in the recorded history of the human species. And here is the most extraordinary part, the part that will truly stop your breath, just as the virus itself stopped. The breath of 675,000 Americans. The United States government knew it was coming. Doctors warned about it. Newspapers tried to report on it. Military commanders watched it tear through their camps with terrifying speed. And yet, the government did almost nothing. Worse than nothing, they actively covered it up. They silenced the doctors. They prosecuted the newspapers. They held massive public parades in cities already erupting with disease. They sent hundreds of thousands of soldiers home from infected camps, spreading the killer across the country like seeds blown in the wind. The story of the 1918 Spanish flu is not merely a medical story. It is a political story. It is a story of power and cowardice, of patriotism weaponized against common sense, of an entire civilization shaking at its foundations and trying desperately to pretend it was not. It is a story of extraordinary heroism. The nurses who walked into houses of the dead, the young volunteers who threw themselves into the fray and gave their lives, the lonely doctors on horseback who rode through blizzards to reach patients they could barely help. It is a story of breathtaking scientific discovery. The researchers who, decades later, dug through permafrost in the frozen wastelands of Alaska to retrieve the genetic blueprint of a virus that had vanished from the earth, and then reconstructed it in a laboratory to understand exactly what it was that had killed so many millions. And it is, most of all, a story about forgetting. The Spanish flu is sometimes called the forgotten pandemic, not because it left no evidence, but because a traumatized civilization chose, collectively and almost deliberately, to forget. While World War I generated an ocean of literature, art, poetry and memory, thousands of books, hundreds of films, countless monuments and memorial days, the pandemic that killed far more people than the war was barely mentioned, barely commemorated, barely discussed. The generation that survived it went back to work the very next year. They danced, they built skyscrapers, they invented jazz, they drove automobiles and bought refrigerators and went to the movies. They called it the Roaring Twenties, and they roared with an energy that may have had something to do with the sheer animal relief of having survived. But forgetting has a price. The lessons that could have been learned from 1918 were not learned, or were learned only partially, or imperfectly, or too late. And so, when the next great pandemic came, as it always does, the world found itself stumbling through the same darkness, asking the same questions, making some of the same mistakes. This is the story of what actually happened, all of it. The full, terrible, astonishing truth. Part 1. The World Before the Storm. January 1918. The World at War. The world in January 1918 was a world in agony. For nearly 4 years, the nations of Europe had been locked in the most catastrophic conflict in human history, a war that had chewed through a generation of young men like a machine, leaving behind miles of muddy trenches, mountains of barbed wire, and oceans of blood. The Western Front stretched for 400 miles across France and Belgium, a long, festering wound across the face of Europe, and in the trenches that lined it, millions of men lived like animals, cold, wet, terrified, packed together in conditions that would have appalled a medieval peasant. The United States had been watching this horror from across the Atlantic, officially neutral but increasingly uncomfortable with neutrality. American banks were lending money to the Allies. American factories were making ammunition and weapons and sending them to Britain and France. American public opinion, carefully cultivated by British propaganda and genuinely outraged by German submarine attacks on civilian ships, was slowly turning toward intervention. And then, in April 1917, President Woodrow Wilson, the man who had won re-election in 1916 partly on the slogan, "He kept us out of war," took the United States into the war. The decision was enormously consequential in ways that went far beyond the battlefield. To fight a modern industrial war, America needed soldiers, millions of them. In June 1917, Congress passed the Selective Service Act, authorizing a national draft. Men between the ages of 21 and 31 were required to register. Eventually, the age range would expand to 18 through 45. By the end of the war, the U.S. Army would grow from 378,000 soldiers to 4.7 million, an increase of more than 12 times. To train all these men, the Army built or expanded 32 large training camps across the country, each housing between 25,000 and 55,000 soldiers, packed together in barracks, eating in the same mess halls, sleeping in the same dormitories, using the same latrines. These camps were, from an epidemiological standpoint, extraordinarily dangerous places. Thousands upon thousands of young men, drawn from every corner of America, carrying with them every regional strain of every common illness, were brought together into close physical proximity and subjected to the physical stress of military training. They were often malnourished, they were exhausted, their immune systems were under constant pressure. If a novel pathogen were to emerge somewhere in the vicinity of such a camp, it would find a population almost ideally suited for rapid, explosive spread. But in January 1918, nobody was thinking about novel pathogens. The newspapers were full of war news. The Meuse-Argonne offensive, the armistice negotiations that everyone hoped were coming, the revolutionary chaos in Russia following the Bolshevik seizure of power in October 1917. Americans were worried about the price of coal, which had skyrocketed due to the war. They were participating in wheatless Mondays and meatless Tuesdays, government-mandated conservation programs designed to ensure that enough food reached the troops in Europe. They were buying Liberty bonds, the war bonds that the government sold to finance the conflict with patriotic fervor. Women were sewing bandages and knitting socks for soldiers. Boy Scouts were collecting scrap metal and peach pits, which could be turned into the charcoal used in gas masks. It was a society in the grip of a collective emotional state that historians have called war fever, a condition in which normal critical faculties are suspended in the name of national unity, in which dissent becomes suspicious and conformity becomes virtue, in which the government's authority over the lives of private citizens expands enormously, and people largely accept this expansion as necessary and proper. This war fever, as we shall see, would play a crucial role in the disaster that was about to unfold. Because when a government has taught its people that questioning authority is unpatriotic, and when that same government needs to keep morale high to continue a war, it becomes very difficult for anyone in a position of power to say, "Stop. Something terrible is happening. We need to take action, even if that action disrupts the war effort." That was the world in January 1918. A world balanced on the edge of a knife, holding its breath, waiting for the war to end. It had no idea that a different kind of catastrophe was already taking shape in a remote corner of southwestern Kansas. Haskell County, Kansas. January 1918. Haskell County, Kansas is one of the most isolated places in the continental United States. Located in the southwestern corner of the state on the edge of the high plains, it is a flat, wind-scoured land of immense distances and sparse population. In January 1918, it was home to perhaps a few thousand people, farmers and ranchers, most of them people who lived close to the land and far from the centers of power and culture. Dr. Loring. Miner was Haskell County's doctor. He was a large, powerful man, old-fashioned in his methods, but with a genuine scientific curiosity that led him to read widely in medical literature and to take careful notes on his cases. In late January and early February of 1918, Dr. Miner began to see patients with an unusual and disturbing pattern of illness. They came to him with the symptoms of influenza, fever, chills, aching muscles, profound fatigue, but the severity was unlike anything he had seen before. His patients were not the elderly or the very young, the populations normally most vulnerable to flu. They were healthy young men and women, some of them the strongest, most robust people in the county, and they were dying. The pneumonia that followed the flu in these cases was particularly vicious. Within hours of the onset of respiratory symptoms, patients could turn blue, a phenomenon called cyanosis, indicating that the blood was not receiving enough oxygen. Their lungs filled with fluid. They drowned from the inside. Dr. Miner had been practicing medicine for decades, and he had never seen anything quite like it. Worried, he did what a responsible physician should do. He reported what he was seeing to the U.S. Public Health Service. In early April 1918, a brief mention of 18 severe cases and 3 deaths in Haskell, Kansas, appeared in a government public health report. And then, silence. Nobody came to investigate. Nobody issued warnings. The report was filed and the world moved on, but the virus did not move on. It was just getting started. Camp Funston, Fort Riley, Kansas, March 4th, 1918. Fort Riley, Kansas, is one of the oldest and largest military installations in the United States. In March 1918, it was home to Camp Funston, one of the Army's largest training facilities housing more than 50,000 soldiers. The camp was enormous, a small city really, with its own hospitals, mess halls, churches, movie theaters, and baseball fields. It was also, in March 1918, extremely crowded and not particularly clean. The Army was processing men as fast as it could, trying to get them trained and shipped to France before the spring offensives began. On the morning of March 4th, 1918, Private Albert Gitchell, an Army cook, reported to the camp infirmary. He was complaining of what he called a bad cold, a sore throat, headache, fever, severe muscle aches. His temperature was 104 degrees. The infirmary sergeant noted his complaint and sent him to see the doctor. Right behind Gitchell came Corporal Lee W. Drake with exactly the same symptoms, then Sergeant Adolph Herbie. By noon, the infirmary had seen more than 100 cases. By the end of the week, that number had quintupled, with 500 soldiers sick. Dr. Loring Miner's patients in Haskell County had been sending their sons to Camp Funston. Young men who had grown up on farms near the county had been drafted, made the journey to Fort Riley, and brought with them whatever virus had been circulating in that isolated southwestern Kansas community. Exactly how the virus moved from Haskell County to Fort Riley is not something that can be established with absolute certainty. The historical record is incomplete, and the people who could have answered the question with authority were not paying close enough attention at the time. But the circumstantial evidence is strong, the timing fits, the geography fits, and Dr. John Barry, one of the foremost historians of the 1918 pandemic, has made a compelling case that Haskell County, Kansas, was the birthplace of the most deadly influenza virus in recorded human history. The Army noticed the outbreak at Camp Funston, of course. It was impossible to miss, with hundreds of soldiers filling the infirmary. But the Army's response was minimal. The sick were quarantined to some degree, and the medical staff worked to treat the pneumonia cases with what they had available, which was not much. There were no antiviral drugs. There were no effective influenza vaccines. Treatment was essentially supportive. rest, fluids, and hope. Some patients recovered. Others developed pneumonia and died. But the key fact, the fact that would determine the fate of millions of people around the world, is that the army did not shut down Camp Funston. It did not close the mess halls. It did not cancel the troop movements that were scheduled to take place in the coming weeks. It did not, in any meaningful sense, try to contain the outbreak, because the war was the priority. Men were needed in France. And in the context of 1918, a few hundred sick soldiers in Kansas did not seem like a reason to disrupt the greatest military mobilization in American history, so the soldiers trained. And when their training was complete, they boarded troop trains and traveled to ports on the East Coast, and there they boarded troop ships, enormous vessels packed with men sleeping in stacked bunks, sharing bathrooms, eating in crowded mess decks, breathing recirculated air for weeks at a time, and the virus traveled with them. The virus crosses the Atlantic. Spring 1918. By May 1918, hundreds of thousands of American soldiers were traveling across the Atlantic each month. The convoys were staggering in their scale, one of the greatest movements of people in human history, all concentrated into the narrow window of a few months as the United States tried to tip the balance of the war before Germany could launch its spring offensive. And embedded in this vast human migration, invisible and unfelt, was the H1N1 influenza virus. The first wave of the flu had moved through much of the United States in March and April, causing serious illness, but not the catastrophic mortality that would come later. It seemed, to those who noticed it at all, like a somewhat unusual flu season. More cases than typical, more severe than average, but not something that triggered emergency measures. The spring wave was just getting started when it began to subside in America, as flu viruses often do when the weather warms. Public health authorities breathed a tentative sigh of relief. They should not have. The virus had not gone away. It had traveled to Europe. In France, the American soldiers who had carried the virus across the ocean began to fall sick. French soldiers caught it from them. British soldiers caught it from the French. German soldiers on the other side of no man's land caught it too. By May 1918, the flu was burning through the armies on both sides of the Western Front with alarming speed. French and British reports described it as three-day fever, or la grippe, the grip. German General Erich Ludendorff, planning the last great German offensive of the war, watched with horror as his troops were felled by thousands. In his memoirs, he would later write that the illness had been a grievous business that had greatly handicapped his military preparations. He was furious about it, and he was desperate to keep it secret from the Allied forces, who might take advantage of his weakened state. This is one of the great strategic coincidences of World War I, the German spring offensive of 1918, which came close to breaking the Allied lines and potentially winning the war for Germany, may have been weakened in part by influenza. Ludendorff's July offensive, his last major push, was a failure, and he later pointed to the flu as one of the reasons. Whether the pandemic actually changed the outcome of the war is a question historians debate to this day, but what is not in doubt is that the virus was killing and incapacitating soldiers on both sides, and that the military commanders on both sides were desperately trying to hide this fact. This is also when the virus got its famous misnomer. Spain, unlike the major belligerent nations, was neutral in World War I. Spanish newspapers were not subject to the wartime censorship that muzzled the press in Britain, France, Germany, Austria, and, as we shall see, the United States. When the flu hit Spain in May 1918, causing serious illness across the country and striking down, among others, King Alfonso XIII himself, the Spanish newspapers reported it. They reported it openly, in detail, with the kind of thorough coverage that a serious epidemic warranted. Their stories were picked up by newspapers around the world, and since Spanish coverage was virtually the only open, uncensored coverage, Available, readers and editors around the world naturally assumed that the disease had originated in Spain. The Spanish were outraged. They pointed out, quite correctly, that the virus had not come from Spain. It had come from France, brought by soldiers and travelers from the fighting front. They called it the French flu. But their protests were futile. The name Spanish flu stuck in one of history's more enduring ironies. The only country that told the truth about the epidemic ended up having its name permanently attached to it, while the countries that lied and covered up went unpunished. The lie takes shape. America, spring and summer 1918. Back in the United States, the federal government was in a peculiar position. It knew that something was wrong. Army and Navy medical officers were sending reports up the chain of command about the flu outbreaks in the training camps. The U.S. Public Health Service had received Dr. Miner's report from Haskell County. Officials were aware that the disease was spreading through Europe. But the war was the overriding priority, and President Woodrow Wilson had made clear that nothing was to be allowed to interfere with the war effort or undermine public morale. Wilson was, in many respects, an extraordinary man. Intellectually brilliant, politically sophisticated, personally principled in ways that some other politicians were not. But he was also rigid, moralistic, and prone to a kind of high-minded ruthlessness that could produce terrible consequences when his values pointed in the wrong direction. During the war, Wilson's value was victory, unconditional, absolute, total. He genuinely believed that World War I was a war to end all wars, that American participation would result in a just and lasting peace, and that any sacrifice was justified in the service of this goal. To protect this goal, Wilson's government had put in place an extraordinary apparatus of control. In June 1917, Congress passed the Espionage Act, which made it a federal crime to interfere with military operations or recruitment, to cause insubordination in the armed forces, or to support America's enemies. The penalties were severe, up to 20 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. In May 1918, Congress passed the Sedition Act, which went even further, making it a crime to willfully utter, print, write, or publish any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the government, the Constitution, the armed forces, or the American flag. These laws were used aggressively. Socialist presidential candidate Eugene V. Debs was sentenced to 10 years in prison for a speech opposing the draft. Newspapers that questioned the war's conduct were harassed, had their mailing privileges revoked, or were outright prosecuted. Citizens who publicly expressed skepticism about the war faced social ostracism, sometimes violence from vigilante groups, and occasionally criminal prosecution. The Committee on Public Information, a government propaganda agency headed by journalist George Creel, produced a torrent of patriotic content and actively worked to suppress dissenting voices. In this environment, who was going to stand up and say, "Stop the troop movements, close the public gatherings, warn the people about the dangerous illness spreading through the military camps"? Who was going to report, accurately, responsibly, on the epidemic that was building in America's military installations? Almost nobody. A few brave voices tried. The Jefferson County Union, a small newspaper in Wisconsin, attempted to sound alarm bells about the pandemic in September 1918 and was prosecuted under the Espionage and Sedition Acts for hurting morale on the home front. The message was clear: report on the flu at your own risk. So most newspapers did not report on it, or reported on it with the kind of breezy reassurance that the government wanted. Nothing to worry about, just a little seasonal illness. Our brave boys can handle it. Meanwhile, in the summer of 1918, the virus was doing something that would make the coming autumn far more deadly. It was mutating. Part 2. the monster changes its face. The science of catastrophe. To understand what happened in the autumn of 1918, why the second wave of the pandemic was so vastly more deadly than the first, you need to understand something about how influenza viruses work, and the story of how scientists eventually came to understand the 1918 flu is itself one of the most extraordinary tales in the history of medicine. Influenza is caused by a family of viruses that exist primarily in birds, hence the scientific name avian influenza for the basic viral lineage. Occasionally, these viruses mutate in ways that allow them to infect other species, including pigs and humans. The H1N1 virus that caused the 1918 pandemic was, in the language of modern virology, a novel strain, a virus to which the human immune system had essentially no prior exposure and therefore no pre-existing immunity. This is what virologists call a pandemic strain, a virus that can spread easily from person to person and against which the human population has no collective defense. When such a virus emerges, it spreads with frightening speed. But here is the crucial biological reality that shaped the disaster of 1918. Influenza viruses mutate constantly. Every time the virus replicates inside a human cell, there is a small chance that it will make a copying error, a mutation. Most mutations are harmless or actually weakening to the virus, but some mutations can make the virus more transmissible, more able to evade immune defenses, or more dangerous to the host. The spring wave of 1918, while serious, was not the catastrophe that autumn would become. It had a fatality rate, the percentage of infected people who died, that was higher than normal seasonal flu, but not dramatically higher. Many people recovered, and crucially, those who recovered had some degree of immune memory that would protect them, at least partially, from future exposure. But over the summer of 1918, something happened to the virus as it moved through populations. In Europe and America, as it passed from person to person in the crowded trenches of the Western Front and the crowded training camps of the American Army, it changed. It developed mutations that made it more dangerous in ways that were deeply unusual, mutations that would not be fully understood for nearly 80 years, when scientists finally managed to reconstruct and analyze the actual genetic sequence of the 1918 virus. The mutation that made the 1918 flu so uniquely deadly involved the virus's ability to trigger what immunologists call a cytokine storm, an overreaction of the immune system that is particularly severe in people with strong, healthy immune systems. In a normal flu infection, the immune system mounts a response that is roughly proportional to the threat. It releases immune signaling molecules, cytokines, to fight the virus. The patient runs a fever, the infection is cleared, and the patient recovers. But in severe 1918 infections, the virus somehow triggered a massively disproportionate immune response. The immune system, essentially panicking in the presence of a pathogen it had never encountered before, flooded the lungs with immune cells and fluid in a desperate attempt to fight the infection, and in doing so, destroyed the lung tissue it was trying to protect. This is why the 1918 flu was so particularly lethal to young adults between the ages of 20 and 40, the population. With the strongest, most robust immune systems, their very health made them more vulnerable. Their immune systems fought harder and did more damage. And this is why the disease defied every expectation. The young and the strong died at horrifying rates, while the elderly, whose immune systems were weaker and mounted a less violent response, sometimes survived better than their children. None of this was understood in 1918. The science of virology barely existed. Viruses themselves had only been recognized as a distinct category of pathogen a few decades earlier, and the tools to study them in any detail did not yet exist. Doctors and scientists in 1918 did not even know with certainty what caused influenza. Many believed it was caused by a bacterium, Pfeiffer's bacillus, or Haemophilus influenza. a name that reflected this belief, even though the bacterium turned out to be a secondary opportunistic infection rather than the primary cause. They had no antiviral drugs, no effective vaccines for the specific strain, and only the most rudimentary understanding of how respiratory viruses spread. What they had was observation, and what they observed as autumn 1918 arrived was something that had never been seen before in recorded medical history. The second wave arrives. August-September 1918. The summer of 1918 passed almost quietly. The flu seemed to have retreated. In America, the worst of the spring wave was over, and while the disease was still circulating in Europe, it seemed to be following the normal seasonal pattern, moving from spring into summer and then fading. Public health officials who had been quietly worried about the spring wave allowed themselves a measure of cautious relief. They were wrong to do so. The virus had not faded. It had been waiting. In late August 1918, reports began to come in from three widely separated locations almost simultaneously. Brest, France, where American troops were arriving by the shipload. Freetown, Sierra Leone. In West Africa, where British naval ships were taking on coal, and Boston, Massachusetts, where the U.S. Navy had a major installation. In all three places, the same thing was happening. Sailors and soldiers were collapsing with a new, far more virulent form of flu. And in this new form, the distinctive feature that had puzzled doctors in the spring was even more pronounced. Young, healthy adults were dying, and dying fast. The second wave of the 1918 pandemic is one of the most terrifying events in the history of public health. It moved with extraordinary speed, burning through populations that had no immunity and no effective means of defense. From its simultaneous eruptions in the late summer, it spread in all directions, east and west, north and south, following the arteries of transportation that connected the modern world. In the United States, the second wave first made itself known in Boston. On September 7, 1918, 300 sailors from Boston were transferred to the Puget Sound Naval Station in Philadelphia. They brought the virus with them. By September 15, the Commonwealth Pier facility in Boston reported cases among its sailors and civilians. By late September, Camp Devens, the Army training camp just outside Boston, was in crisis. The story of Camp Devens in September 1918 deserves to be told in detail because it captures, in concentrated and horrifying form, what was happening across the entire country. Camp Devens, September 1918. Camp Devens, in Ayer, Massachusetts, housed approximately 45,000 soldiers in September 1918. It was a new camp, built hurriedly to accommodate the massive expansion of the Army. And like all of the wartime training camps, it was crowded, far more crowded than any peacetime military planner would have considered acceptable. Barracks designed for a certain number of men held far more. Mess halls were stretched far beyond capacity. The medical facilities, designed for a normal peacetime level of illness, were utterly unprepared for what was coming. Dr. Roy Grist, a physician stationed at Camp Devens, wrote a letter to a colleague on September 29, 1918, that has become one of the most quoted documents of the 1918 pandemic. A first-hand account of horror that reads, even a century later, with a visceral immediacy that can make your hands go cold. Camp Devens is near Boston and has about 50,000 men, or did have. Before this epidemic broke loose, it has hit us like a ton of bricks. These men start with what appears to be an ordinary attack of la grippe or influenza, and when brought to the hosp, they very rapidly develop the most vicious type of pneumonia that has ever been seen. 2 hours after admission, they have the mahogany spots over the cheekbones, and a few hours later you can begin to see the cyanosis extending from their ears and spreading all over the face, until it is hard to tell the colored men from the white. It is only a matter of a few hours then until death comes, and it is simply a struggle for air until they suffocate. It is horrible. One can stand it to see 1, 2, or 20 men die, but to see these poor devils dropping like flies sort of gets on your nerves. We have been averaging about 100 deaths per day and still keeping it up. There is no doubt in my mind that there is a new mixed plague, for the pneumonia is not the old-fashioned pneumonia, but a pneumonia that simply is a mush lung or a wet lung. We have lost an outrageous number of nurses and doctors. It beats any sight they ever had in France after a battle. An extraordinary thing is that it has occurred in other camps also. We will lose more men from this than we did in France. The mahogany spots that Dr. Grist described, the reddish-brown patches that appeared over the cheekbones of seriously ill patients, were caused by tiny hemorrhages under the skin, a sign that the body's blood vessels were breaking down. The cyanosis, the spreading blue-black color that nurses learned to watch for, first at the ears, then across the face, then down toward the extremities, was the visible sign of oxygen deprivation, the body's tissues literally turning blue. As they were starved of the oxygen they needed, nurses at Camp Devens developed a grim triage system. They would look first at the patient's feet. If the feet were already black, the patient was considered beyond saving and was moved aside to die while medical resources were directed toward those who might still be helped. Within 2 weeks, Camp Devens had 14,000 flu cases, nearly a quarter of its entire population. The camp hospital, designed for 1,200 patients, was holding as many as 6,000. Soldiers lay on cots in the hallways, in the chapel, in any space that could be found. Hundreds of doctors and nurses were themselves sick. Doctors from other facilities were brought in as emergency reinforcements, and some of them became sick too. Meanwhile, one of the most consequential decisions of the entire pandemic was being made, or rather not made. The army did not shut down Camp Devens. It did not stop the flow of men to and from the camp. It continued to transfer soldiers, some of whom were incubating the virus without yet showing symptoms, to other camps and other facilities across the country. Because, and this is crucial, the army was still at war. The Meuse-Argonne offensive, the largest military operation in American history, was about to begin. Men were needed. The war did not stop for the flu, and so the virus spread. From Camp Devens to other camps, from the camps to the cities, and from the cities carried by travelers on trains and boats and automobiles to every corner of the country. Part 3, City by City, Death by Death. Philadelphia, the catastrophe of hubris. No story of the 1918 flu pandemic is more famous or more instructive than what happened in Philadelphia. It is the story of how a great city, warned of disaster, chose to ignore the warning and paid a devastating price. Philadelphia in 1918 was a city of 2 million people, one of the largest in the United States, a bustling industrial center where factories made ships, ammunition, textiles, and machinery for the war effort. It was also a city whose public health apparatus was, by the standards of the time, genuinely excellent. Philadelphia had one of the better organized health departments in the country, and its director, Dr. Wilmer Cruzen, was a capable administrator. By mid-September 1918, the flu was already in Philadelphia. 300 sailors transferred from Boston had arrived in the city on September 7th, and they were sick. Cases were appearing among the civilian population. Dr. Howard Anders, a prominent Philadelphia physician, went to the newspapers and publicly warned that the city was in danger. He called for the cancellation of a massive public event that was scheduled for September 28th, a Liberty Loan Parade designed to sell war bonds and boost morale that would stretch for 23 city blocks and draw an expected crowd of more than 200,000 people. Dr. Cruzen refused to cancel the parade. His stated reason was that cancellation would hurt morale and undermine the war effort. His unstated reason The reason that everyone in the room understood without saying was that the Wilson administration's apparatus of propaganda and censorship made it politically impossible to take any action that could be construed as alarmist. Newspapers that had tried to report accurately on the flu were being prosecuted. Officials who raised concerns were politically vulnerable. The path of least resistance and political safety was to say nothing and do nothing. The newspapers knew the truth. Philadelphia's doctors knew the truth. But the newspapers, cowed by the Espionage and Sedition Acts, refused to publish the warnings that the doctors were giving them. When Dr. Anders went to the press with his concerns, the press declined to run the story. The Liberty Loan Parade went forward on September 28, 1918. It was, by contemporary accounts, a spectacular event. Bands playing, flags waving, aircraft flying overhead, hundreds of thousands of Philadelphians lining the 23-block parade route, pressed together, cheering, breathing the autumn air. It was, in the words of one historian, a super-spreader event on a scale that would not be matched until the age of modern mass gatherings. Within 48 hours of the parade, every single bed in every single hospital in Philadelphia was occupied. Within a week, the city was in chaos. Dr. Cruzen, the man who had refused to cancel the parade, issued urgent appeals for nurses and physicians. By October 1st, just 3 days after the parade, the city's death toll was already shocking. By October 5th, 2,600 people had died in a single week. And the numbers kept climbing. The city ran out of coffins. It ran out of gravediggers. Bodies lay in private homes for days because no undertaker could come to claim them. Undertakers who did come to collect bodies raised their prices by as much as 600%, and there was still not enough of them. The city requisitioned a trolley car manufacturer's facility and ordered them to produce wooden coffins instead of trolley cars. Cold storage plants were converted into temporary morgues. A Catholic priest, Father Joseph Corrigan, organized a team of men to go door to door through the worst-hit neighborhoods of South Philadelphia, an area of crowded tenements where Italian and Eastern European immigrants lived in particularly close quarters, collecting the bodies of the dead and transporting them to the hastily constructed morgues in horse-drawn wagons. In a single 6-week period, nearly 14,000 people died in Philadelphia, one death every 5 minutes around the clock. By the end of the pandemic's run through the city, 17,500 people were dead. More people died in Philadelphia in October 1918 than in any comparable period in the city's history before or since. More than in the Civil War draft riots, more than in any industrial accident, more than in any natural disaster. And much of it, most historians believe, was preventable if the parade had been cancelled, if warnings had been heeded, if the government had told the truth. There is a document that captures the mood of Philadelphia in those weeks with heartbreaking precision. It is a letter written by a factory worker named Caroline Mather to a friend out of state. She wrote, "The streets are quiet. Not quiet like Sunday quiet, but like dead quiet. There are not many people out. When you do see someone, they walk, fast with their head down, not meeting your eyes. The neighbors do not come out to talk anymore. Mrs. Williams next door, her husband died on Tuesday. We did not even know he was sick. The children are home from school, but they are not playing. They sit at the window and watch the street. What is there to watch? Nothing. Nobody. The city has gone inside, or gone away, or gone into the ground. I don't know which." St. Louis, the city that did the right thing. Contrast Philadelphia's story with what happened 200 miles to the west in St. Louis, Missouri. The difference between these two cities' responses to the 1918 flu is one of the most important case studies in the history of public health, a stark, measurable demonstration of what good leadership and quick action can accomplish even in the face of a deadly pandemic. St. Louis's public health commissioner was Dr. Max Starkloff, a physician who had spent years studying infectious disease, and who understood more intuitively than most of his peers that the only tool available, in the absence of a vaccine, was reduction of human contact, keeping infected people away from uninfected people. When reports of the second wave began to reach St. Louis in late September 1918, Starkloff moved quickly. On October 7, 1918, while Philadelphia was already drowning in its dead, Starkloff closed all of St. Louis's public schools. He closed churches. He closed theaters, movie houses, dance halls, pool parlors, and nightclubs. He banned public gatherings of more than 20 people. He required businesses to stagger their opening and closing hours to reduce crowding on the streetcars. He quarantined known cases. He required anyone showing symptoms to remain at home and report to public health authorities. The contrast with Philadelphia's Liberty Loan Parade could not have been more stark. While Philadelphia was bringing 200,000 people together in a single outdoor crowd, St. Louis was systematically disassembling the social infrastructure that allowed the virus to spread, and the numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. St. Louis's peak death rate from the 1918 flu was 1/8 of Philadelphia's peak death rate. The overall death toll in St. Louis was roughly half of what comparable cities with less aggressive responses experienced. In a 2007 analysis of death records from the 1918 pandemic, researchers found that cities that acted quickly, closing schools, banning gatherings, implementing quarantine measures, had significantly lower death tolls than those that moved slowly or not at all. The early and aggressive response saved thousands of lives. Dr. Starkloff's actions were not without controversy. Businessmen complained about the economic losses from closures. Church leaders objected to the banning of services. Civil libertarians raised questions about the constitutionality of government orders that restricted where people could go and what they could do. These were legitimate concerns, not so different from the debates that would play out again in future pandemics. But Dr. Starkloff held firm, and St. Louis survived the pandemic with a fraction of the casualties that other great American cities endured. New York City, the tenements, and the dead. New York City in 1918 was the largest city in the United States, home to more than 5 million people crowded into the 5 boroughs of Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, and Staten Island. It was a city of staggering inequality. Magnificent mansions on Fifth Avenue, towering skyscrapers in Midtown, and miles upon miles of tenements on the Lower East Side and in the immigrant neighborhoods of Brooklyn and the Bronx, where families of 6 or 8 lived in 2-room apartments without adequate ventilation, heating, or sanitation. New York City's health commissioner was Dr. Royal Copeland, a skilled political operator who was also genuinely committed to public health. Copeland acted early, adding influenza to the list of reportable diseases, requiring all cases to be isolated at home or in the hospital, attempting to control the flow of infected people through the city. But in a metropolis of 5 million people, living in conditions of extreme density, many of them too poor to stay home from work even when sick, too afraid of losing their jobs to report their illness to authorities, too distrustful of government. With good reason, given many communities' historical experiences, to cooperate with public health measures in such a city containing an airborne virus was almost impossibly difficult. The flu hit New York's immigrant communities with particular force. In the tenements of the Lower East Side, where Russian and Polish Jewish families, Italian families, and families from dozens of other countries lived in near unbelievable crowding, sometimes as many as 12 people to a 2-room apartment, with shared bathrooms on each floor and shared courtyards where garbage and laundry competed for space, the virus spread with terrifying speed. There were no resources to quarantine effectively. There were no resources to provide adequate medical care. There were no resources to ensure that sick people could afford to stay home and rest rather than going to work. Visiting nurses sent by public health departments and charitable organizations into the tenement districts found conditions that shocked even experienced social workers. One nurse described finding a husband dead in the same room where his wife lay with newly born twins. It had been 24 hours since the death and the births, and the wife had had no food but an apple, which happened to lie within reach. The imagery is almost medieval in its bleakness. A dead man on one side of a small room, his wife unable to move, holding newborn twins, alone, with no one to help, in a city of millions. By the end of the pandemic, New York City had buried 33,000 people. It was the largest single city death toll in the country, a natural consequence of the city's size and density, but per capita, adjusted for population, cities like Philadelphia and some smaller industrial towns actually had worse death rates. The measures Copeland had put in place, imperfect as they were, had some effect. San Francisco, the mask wars. San Francisco's experience of the 1918 flu is notable for several reasons, not least because it generated one of the stranger episodes of American public health history, the Anti-Mask League. In October 1918, San Francisco's Board of Health, watching the pandemic destroy cities to the east, issued an order requiring anyone who served the public to wear a mask in public. A few weeks later, the order was extended to the general population. Everyone in San Francisco was required to wear a mask outside their homes. The masks, made of gauze, were distributed by the Red Cross and other organizations. The ordinance was taken seriously by many San Franciscans. Photographs from October 1918 show city streets where virtually everyone visible is wearing a mask, a scene eerily reminiscent of images from more recent pandemic years. The mask order worked, at least for a while. San Francisco's first wave death toll was lower than it might otherwise have been. Encouraged, city leaders declared victory and lifted the mask mandate in November 1918. As Armistice Day celebrations brought hundreds of thousands of people into the streets. The celebrations were a disaster. People gathered in enormous crowds, cheering, hugging strangers, doing everything that public health common sense should have warned against. And the virus, which had been suppressed but not eliminated, came roaring back. A second round of closures and mask mandates followed. And this time, there was pushback. On January 25, 1919, approximately 2,000 people, some accounts say as many as 4,000 or 5,000, packed into San Francisco's old Dreamland rink for a rally organized by the Anti-Mask League. The league was led by Mrs. E.C. Harrington, a suffragist, attorney, and labor rights activist who argued that the mask mandates were politically motivated, scientifically dubious, and an infringement on civil liberties. The meeting was passionate and contentious. Some speakers argued on scientific grounds that the gauze masks were ineffective against airborne viruses. Others argued on civil liberties grounds that the government had no right to mandate what people wore on their own faces, and some argued that the mask mandate was being used as a political tool, a way for certain city officials to expand their power under the guise of public health. Not all of the objections were without merit. The gauze masks of 1918 were indeed not particularly effective by modern standards. They could reduce the spread of large respiratory droplets, but they were not designed to filter the smallest airborne particles. And questions about government, authority, and individual liberty are not inherently frivolous, even in times of public health emergency. But the timing was catastrophic. San Francisco was in the middle of a deadly pandemic, and the Anti-Mask League was holding a rally that itself constituted exactly the kind of mass gathering that the public health authorities were trying to prevent. At the rally, the virus was presumably spreading among the very people who had come to protest measures designed to prevent its spread. The political theater of the mask controversy had a dark, comedic aspect that San Francisco newspaper writers could not resist. At a boxing match in the city, a police photographer captured images of city supervisors, a congressman, a justice, a Navy rear admiral, the city's own health officer, and even the mayor, all sitting unmasked in flagrant violation of the ordinance they were supposed to be enforcing. The health officer paid a $5 fine. The mayor paid $50. Neither faced the prison time that ordinary masked slackers could face. The almanac writer Alma Whitaker in the Los Angeles Times observed with acidic wit that famous people shunned them because it was so horrid to go unrecognized, and described the funniest sights at big restaurants, with all the waiters and diners masked, the latter just raising their screen to pop in a mouthful of food. The American South and the West, nowhere to hide. The pandemic did not confine itself to the great eastern cities. It moved with the same relentless efficiency through the American South, through the segregated mill towns of North Carolina, through the cotton farming communities of Mississippi and Alabama, through the bayous and swamps of Louisiana, and through the wide open spaces of the American West, following the railroad lines and the rivers, climbing into the mountains of Colorado and Utah, crossing the deserts of Arizona and Nevada, reaching the Pacific coast. In the South, the pandemic intersected with the brutal realities of American racial segregation to produce a catastrophe within a catastrophe. African Americans, already living with the compounded disadvantages of poverty, discrimination, inadequate nutrition, lack of access to medical care, and the physical toll of the most demanding and least paid forms of labor, faced the 1918 flu from a position of particular vulnerability. Segregated hospitals either refused to admit black patients altogether or assigned them to poorly equipped, understaffed, separate wards. White physicians who might have seen black patients were often unavailable or unwilling. The black community's own doctors, of whom there were far too few, their numbers limited by systematic exclusion from medical schools and professional associations, were overwhelmed almost immediately. Some public health officials of the era actually claimed that African Americans were less susceptible to the flu, a piece of medical mythology that reflected the broader pattern of racist pseudoscience common in early 20th century American medicine. This claim was false, as the actual death data from black communities demonstrated clearly. In many cities, black mortality rates from the flu were as high as or higher than white mortality rates, and in some regions significantly higher, because of the systematic disadvantages that black Americans faced in accessing care. U.E.B. Du Bois, the great African-American intellectual and activist, wrote about the pandemic's impact on black communities with characteristic clarity and fury, connecting the virus's particular devastation in black neighborhoods directly to the structures of American racism, to segregation, to poverty, to the deliberate exclusion of black Americans from the institutions of social support and medical care that might have helped. In the rural West, the pandemic took on the quality of a ghost story. Isolated communities, connected to the outside world only by infrequent mail deliveries and the occasional railroad train, suddenly confronting a disease they had no warning of and no tools to fight. Some communities simply tried to wall themselves off from the outside world, closing their roads to outsiders and turning away anyone who arrived on the train. A few communities that were geographically isolated enough, deep in mountain valleys, at the end of dead-end roads, actually managed to avoid the worst of the pandemic by this kind of radical isolation. Most could not. Alaska and the permafrost. A tragedy beyond reckoning. The most complete and absolute devastation that the 1918 flu wrought anywhere in the United States fell upon the indigenous peoples of Alaska. The story of what happened in Alaska is so terrible, and the numbers so staggering in proportion to the populations involved, that it stands apart from the rest of the pandemic's narrative as something that approaches a different order of catastrophe entirely. Alaska's indigenous communities, Yupik, Inupiaq, Athabascan, and others, lived in small, remote villages scattered across a vast landscape of tundra, taiga, and coastline. Many of these villages were almost completely isolated during much of the year, accessible only by water in summer and by dog sled in winter. They had little previous exposure to many of the diseases common in the lower 48 states, which meant that when those diseases arrived, they often arrived in populations with no immunity at all. When the 1918 flu reached Alaska in the late fall of 1918, it did so with catastrophic efficiency. The disease moved along the coastlines on supply ships, leaped from village to village along the dog sled trails, and burned through communities that had no doctors, no hospitals, no medicines, and no capacity to isolate the sick from the well. In many villages, the illness struck so rapidly and so universally that there was nobody left healthy enough to care for the sick or bury the dead. Brevig Mission, a small village on the Seward Peninsula of western Alaska, lost 85% of its adult population in a single week in November 1918. 72 people died. The bodies were buried by visiting missionaries and gold miners in a mass grave in the permafrost. A long, narrow trench cut into the frozen ground. The bodies laid out in rows, covered over with earth and left to freeze. The death toll across Alaska's indigenous communities was devastating. Some villages lost all or nearly all of their adults, leaving children with no parents and elders with no one to care for them. The cultural and social consequences, the loss of elders who carried knowledge, language, oral traditions, and practical skills, the dissolution of family structures, the disruption of the traditional practices that allowed communities to survive in one of the harshest environments on Earth, were felt for generations. And yet, decades later, the tragedy of Brevig Mission would contribute something extraordinary to human knowledge. Because of the permafrost, the bodies buried in that mass grave were preserved in near-perfect condition. Frozen solid, essentially mummified by the cold, their tissues intact in ways that would have been impossible in a warmer burial ground. In 1951, a Swedish-born scientist named Johan Hultin traveled to Brevig Mission with the idea of recovering tissue samples from the 1918 flu victims, samples that might allow scientists to study the actual genetic material of the virus. With the permission of the village elders, he excavated the mass grave and collected lung tissue from several of the bodies. He brought the samples back to his laboratory at the University of Iowa, hoping to grow the live virus from them. He failed. The samples were preserved, but not well enough to yield viable viral material. Hultin would try again 46 years later in 1997 at the age of 72. This time, he had reason to hope that the result would be different. Because in the interim, the science of molecular biology had been transformed. Scientists had learned to read not live viruses, but dead genetic material, to sequence fragments of viral RNA preserved in tissue samples and reconstruct the genetic blueprint of pathogens that had been dead for decades. The scientist who made this possible was Dr. Jeffrey Taubenberger, a virologist at the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology in Washington, D.C. In 1996, Taubenberger and his team had managed to retrieve and sequence fragments of the 1918 flu virus's genetic material from preserved lung tissue samples taken from soldiers who had died in military hospitals in 1918 and whose tissue had been stored in paraffin blocks in the Institute's pathology archives. The sequences they recovered were partial, enough to tell them something about the virus's structure, but not enough to reconstruct the complete genome. When Hultin read about Taubenberger's work, he contacted him. He told Taubenberger that he knew where there might be better preserved samples: the mass grave at Brevig Mission in the Alaskan permafrost. Taubenberger was excited. Hultin, at his own expense, traveled back to Alaska. He returned to Brevig Mission, explained his purpose to the village elders, and obtained their permission to excavate the grave again. In the grave, Hultin found the body of a large woman, A woman whose obesity, he reasoned, might mean that her internal organs were better insulated and therefore better preserved. He carefully removed samples of her lung tissue, packed them in preservative, and sent them to Taubenberger's laboratory. The samples were, in the assessment of the scientists, extraordinary. The permafrost had done its job. The tissue was preserved well enough to yield substantial amounts of viral RNA, enough, eventually, to allow the sequencing of the complete 1918 influenza virus genome. Over the next several years, Taubenberger and his colleagues, working in collaboration with a team at the CDC led by Dr. Terence Tumpy, gradually assembled the complete genetic blueprint of the 1918 virus. And then they did something extraordinary and deeply controversial. They reconstructed the live virus in a secure laboratory, using the genetic sequence as their blueprint to understand exactly what made it so uniquely deadly. The research confirmed what had been suspected. The 1918 virus was a novel H1N1 strain with genes of avian origin. A virus that had essentially jumped directly from birds to humans without the intermediate step through pigs that is more common in other flu viruses. Its particular genetic characteristics explained many of its unusual features. Its ability to trigger the cytokine storm that killed young, healthy adults. Its affinity for the lower respiratory tract, which allowed it to cause pneumonia more directly than typical flu strains. Its extraordinary transmissibility. The woman in the Breivik mission mass grave, this large, anonymous Alaska native woman who died in a single terrible week in November 1918, whose body was preserved by permafrost for nearly 80 years, contributed directly to one of the most important scientific discoveries in the history of virology. She does not have a name in the historical record. She was, in the language that Hultin used when he wrote about her, a gift to science. The elders of Breivik mission, when Hultin returned the second time and asked their permission, told him, "We give you permission. Retrieve the virus and make a vaccine so that this will not happen again." Part 4. The government's lie and its consequences. The machinery of denial. By October 1918, it was impossible to maintain the pretense that the flu was not a crisis. But the government's response, characterized by minimization, misdirection, and the deliberate suppression of accurate information, had already done its damage. The window of time when aggressive public health intervention might have significantly blunted the second wave had passed, at least in the cities that had refused to act. What did the government actually do and say during the height of the pandemic? The record is instructive and deeply troubling. Surgeon General Rupert Blue, the head of the U.S. Public Health Service, issued a series of statements that managed to be simultaneously accurate in their individual factual claims and profoundly misleading in their overall effect. He acknowledged that influenza was spreading. He provided general hygiene advice: avoid crowds, wash your hands, see a doctor if you feel ill. He did not, at any point during the critical weeks of the second wave, call for the kind of dramatic, citywide closures and restrictions that Dr. Max Starkloff was implementing in St. Louis. He did not publicly acknowledge the extraordinary mortality rate. He did not publicly describe what doctors in the military camps were witnessing: the mahogany spots, the cyanosis, the bodies piling up faster than they could be buried. Why not? In part because of genuine uncertainty. Public health science in 1918 was not what it is today, and there were real questions about the best course of action, but primarily because of the war. The Espionage and Sedition Acts hung over every official statement like a sword. Any public communication that might demoralize the public or interfere with the war effort was, quite literally, potentially criminal. And Surgeon General Blue was not going to risk his career and his freedom by saying something that the Wilson administration did not want said. Woodrow Wilson himself maintained a virtually total public silence about the pandemic throughout. its run. He never gave a major speech about it. He never issued a public statement that acknowledged its seriousness. He never called on the public to take specific protective measures. He was the most powerful man in the country, the man whose voice could have been used to warn, to prepare, to direct resources and coordinate responses. And he said almost nothing. Wilson's silence is one of the great mysteries of his presidency. Some historians have argued that it reflected a genuine calculation that public panic would be more damaging than the disease itself, that the morale of the home front was essential to victory in France, and that anything that frightened or demoralized the public would ultimately cost more lives than it saved. Others have argued that Wilson was simply politically incapable of acknowledging a domestic crisis while asking Congress and the public for extraordinary sacrifices in the name of the war. Still others have pointed to Wilson's personal psychology, his profound difficulty acknowledging weakness or failure, his tendency to double down on a position rather than admit that circumstances had changed. Whatever the reason, the consequences were severe. Cities that waited for federal leadership before taking action, and there were many, waited too long. Local officials who might have been willing to close schools and ban gatherings were reluctant to do so without clear federal guidance, partly because they feared looking alarmist, and partly because they lacked the authority or the political cover to act alone. The absence of national leadership created a vacuum that was filled in some cities by good local officials like Starkloff and Copeland, and in other cities like Philadelphia by officials who chose denial over action. The newspapers, meanwhile, were caught in an impossible position. The Espionage and Sedition Acts made it genuinely dangerous to report on the pandemic in ways that might be construed as hurting morale or interfering with the war effort. Most newspapers chose to err on the side of caution, publishing the government's reassuring statements, downplaying the severity of the epidemic, and generally doing what government propaganda efforts asked them to do. The result was a catastrophic failure of the free press at precisely the moment when its function, providing citizens with accurate information about matters affecting their lives, was most essential. The few newspapers that tried to report truthfully faced consequences. The Jefferson County Union in Wisconsin attempted to warn its readers about the pandemic and was prosecuted under the Sedition Act. The prosecution was ultimately unsuccessful, but the message was received. Report on the flu at your own risk. In the absence of accurate news, rumors flourished. People speculated that the flu was a German biological weapon, that German agents had introduced the virus into American cities, into army camps, into the ventilation systems of public buildings. This theory was completely false, but it was widely believed, and it captured something real about the moment. A society in the grip of wartime paranoia, conditioned to suspect enemy action behind every misfortune, reaching for a human explanation for a catastrophe that had no human villain. The October death toll, a nation under siege. October 1918 was the deadliest single month in American history, before or since. The pandemic virus killed an estimated 195,000 Americans during that month alone, a death rate that translates to roughly 6,000 deaths every single day, or one death every 14 seconds around the clock. To put that in perspective, the average monthly combat death toll for American soldiers in World War I was approximately 2,000. October 1918's flu deaths were nearly 100 times higher. The United States had mobilized an army of more than 4 million men, built the greatest war machine in American history, spent billions of dollars, and absorbed 2,000 military deaths per month with grim determination. And then the flu came along and killed 95 times more people in a single month, and the government's response was a whisper. The statistics that we know from October 1918 are staggering in their scale. In the week ending October 5th, Philadelphia reported 2,600 deaths. In the week ending October 12th, that number climbed to over 4,500. In a single 6-week period, the city lost nearly 14,000 people. Chicago, which had closed theaters, movie houses, and night schools, was still reporting hundreds of deaths per day. New York was burying bodies as fast as it could. In Washington, D.C., the seat of federal power, the city where the president and Congress lived and worked, the morgues were overwhelmed and the coffin supply was exhausted. The shortage of coffins was not a minor logistical inconvenience. It was a profound social crisis. In a society where proper burial of the dead was a religious, cultural, and emotional necessity, where the rituals surrounding death served a vital psychological function for the bereaved, the inability to bury the dead in a timely and dignified manner inflicted a kind of secondary trauma on already devastated communities. Bodies lay in private homes for days. Families who could afford it paid extortionate prices to private undertakers. Families who could not afford it faced the unimaginable experience of seeing their loved ones' bodies treated as logistical problems to be solved rather than as human beings to be honored. Cold storage plants were requisitioned as temporary morgues. Trolley car manufacturers were ordered to shift production to wooden coffins. City governments scrambled to find extra grave diggers, a task made more difficult by the fact that grave diggers, like everyone else, were getting sick. In some cities, prisoners were used as grave diggers. In a few cases, mass graves were dug. Not the horrifying wartime mass graves of the Western Front, but nonetheless anonymous, undifferentiated burials that violated every norm of the cultures they were imposed upon. The scenes were, by all accounts, almost beyond description. One Philadelphia clergyman, his church ordered closed by public health authorities, a requirement that he protested bitterly, described going to offer last rites to a dying parishioner and finding on the same block 4 houses with the dead still inside. "The street smells of death," he wrote. "I have never smelled it before, but I know it now." Part 5. The humans behind the numbers. Nurses, the heroines of 1918. In October 1918, when the American medical system collapsed under the weight of the pandemic, it was nurses who held what little remained together. And the story of nursing during the 1918 flu is one of the most extraordinary and least told stories in American medical history. By the autumn of 1918, the United States was already experiencing a serious nursing shortage. The war had deployed large numbers of trained nurses overseas and to military hospitals within the country. The civilian nursing workforce had been depleted to serve the military's needs. And then the flu hit, and the remaining nurses were expected to handle a patient load that would have been impossible under any circumstances, let alone under the conditions of a rapidly spreading epidemic that was killing the nurses themselves. Nursing care was essentially the only effective treatment available in 1918. There were no antiviral drugs. The vaccines being hastily produced by pharmaceutical companies were, by and large, ineffective. They targeted bacteria rather than viruses, based on the then common belief that influenza was bacterially caused. What nurses could provide: attentive monitoring, repositioning of patients to help them breathe more easily, cooling compresses for fever, fluids and nutrition where the patient could tolerate them, basic hygiene and cleanliness, was genuinely life-saving in some cases and comfort-giving in all cases. But the conditions in which nurses worked in October 1918 were almost beyond endurance. Hospital wards designed for 50 patients held 200. Nurses worked shifts of 16 or 18 hours, sometimes longer, before collapsing with exhaustion or with the flu. Military nurses at Camp Devens and other large army facilities worked in wards where they could watch patients whom they had admitted in the morning die by the afternoon, having turned blue in the hours between. Visiting nurses in urban tenement districts walked into apartments where entire families were sick, where the dead and the dying lay in the same rooms, where there was no food, no help, no hope of help. Many nurses died. The precise number is difficult to determine. Record-keeping during the pandemic was chaotic, but it is certain that hundreds of trained nurses lost their lives to the flu they caught while caring for patients. Thousands more were temporarily incapacitated by illness, a fact that created a cascading crisis. Nurses who got sick could not work, which meant more patients were left without care, which meant more patients died, which meant more bodies to deal with, which meant more pressure on the nurses who remained healthy enough to work. In many cities, the shortfall in professional nurses was addressed by deploying volunteers, women and some men with no formal medical training, recruited by the Red Cross and local organizations and thrown into hospitals and private homes with minimal preparation. Some of these volunteers had never seen serious illness before. Some of them encountered scenes in the tenements that no amount of preparation could have readied them for. Some of them got sick. Some of them died. Their names are largely lost to history. The famous nurses of World War I, like Edith Cavell, the British nurse executed by the Germans, are remembered because their stories had a particular dramatic quality that lent itself to commemoration. The volunteer nurses of the 1918 flu, who died not at the hands of an enemy soldier, but from an invisible pathogen contracted in a stranger's apartment while trying to bring soup to a sick family. These women have no monuments, no memorial days, no famous names. They simply did what needed to be done, and many of them paid for it with their lives. The children left behind. One of the pandemic's most devastating and least discussed consequences was the generation of orphans it created. The 1918 flu killed disproportionately in the age group of 20 to 40-year-olds, the age of young parents. Across America, children lost fathers, mothers, or both parents to the flu, in numbers that overwhelmed the existing systems for caring for orphaned children. The scale of orphaning is hard to quantify precisely because the record-keeping of the era was imperfect and many family situations were not formally recorded. But historians have estimated that hundreds of thousands of American children lost one or both parents to the 1918 flu, and a 2023 study published in the journal Pediatrics estimated that the pandemic created orphans in unprecedented numbers. What happened to these children? In many cases, they were taken in by relatives, grandparents, aunts and uncles, older siblings, cousins, and absorbed into already struggling households. In communities with strong extended family networks and cultural traditions of taking in orphaned children, this worked reasonably well, even if it placed additional burdens on families that were already dealing with the economic consequences of the pandemic. But in communities where extended family networks were weaker, or where the flu had killed multiple family members, or where poverty made it impossible for relatives to take on additional children, the situation was often tragic. Children's homes and orphanages, already crowded before the pandemic, were overwhelmed. Some children ended up in institutions that bore only a superficial resemblance to the orphanages of popular imagination, underfunded, understaffed, indifferent to the emotional and developmental needs of traumatized children. The long-term psychological consequences of childhood bereavement on the scale created by the 1918 pandemic are difficult to study. The generation in question is gone, and the social science tools for studying such things were not well developed in the 1920s and 1930s when this generation was growing up. But it is reasonable to infer that the sudden, unexpected loss of parents, often both parents, in a context of social chaos and inadequate support systems, inflicted lasting psychological wounds on hundreds of thousands of American children. Wounds that shaped who they became as adults and how they raised their own children. The doctors, heroism, and helplessness. If the nurses were the frontline heroes of the 1918 pandemic, the doctors were figures of a more complicated kind. Brilliant, dedicated, genuinely heroic in many cases, but also operating at the limits of their knowledge in ways that sometimes produced terrible outcomes. American medicine in 1918 was genuinely impressive by the standards of its era. The Johns Hopkins Medical School, founded in 1893, had transformed American medical education. The great universities had research laboratories where real scientific work was being done. Major American cities had well-organized public health departments with trained officers and established procedures. The United States had, by early 20th century standards, a sophisticated medical establishment. But against the 1918 flu, none of this sophistication was particularly useful. The virus was not understood. The fundamental mechanism, the cytokine storm, the destruction of the lung alveoli, the cascade from flu to pneumonia to respiratory failure, was not understood. The available treatments were essentially symptomatic. Aspirin for fever and pain, which in the doses sometimes prescribed may actually have worsened outcomes by promoting the bleeding that was one of the flu's characteristic features. Bed, rest, fluids, oxygen in the cases where the luxury of oxygen equipment existed, and nursing care. Doctors administered various experimental treatments, everything from quinine to castor oil to turpentine applied to the chest. But nothing worked in any consistent or dramatic way. What doctors could do, and what the best of them did, was observe carefully, report accurately, and make the best decisions they could with the information available. Some doctors' observations during the 1918 pandemic were remarkably acute, anticipating the scientific understanding that would not come for another 8 decades. Several physicians noted, in reports written during the acute phase of the pandemic, the unusual pattern of mortality, the W curve of death that showed high mortality at the very old and very young ends of the age spectrum, as was normal for flu, but also a striking peak in the middle of the age curve among healthy young adults that was completely outside normal experience. These observations were filed away in medical journals and government reports, and they were crucial to later scientists who worked to reconstruct what had happened. Some doctors died. The mortality among physicians, who, by the nature of their work, were constantly exposed to the sickest patients, was significant, and their loss created cascading shortages that left communities even more vulnerable. In Nashville, Tennessee, 1/3 of the city's doctors were deployed overseas with the military when the flu hit. The remaining physicians were overwhelmed almost immediately. Cities desperately telegraphed medical schools and hospitals in neighboring states, begging for doctors, getting few or none, and there were the solitary doctors, men like Dr. Angus Hebb of Bridgeton, Maine, who kept 2 horses and a hired driver so that he could nap in his carriage between patient visits, covering an enormous geographic area on his own, seeing dozens of patients a day, treating everyone he could, converting part of his own house into a makeshift hospital because the town had no hospital of its own. Men like this existed in communities across America, overworked, exhausted, often sick themselves, doing what they could in the face of a catastrophe that dwarfed their capacity to respond. The survivors. Lives shaped by catastrophe. 4E. Those who survived the 1918 flu, the majority of those infected, and the large majority of the American population, the experience left marks that varied enormously depending on the individual, their community, their losses, and their circumstances. Some survivors suffered long-term health consequences from the infection itself. The damage that severe flu cases inflicted on the lungs could be permanent, leaving survivors with diminished respiratory function that affected them for years or decades. Some survivors reported cognitive difficulties in the months and years following their illness, problems with memory and concentration that may have reflected the neurological effects of the virus or the aftermath of the severe oxygen deprivation that occurred during cyanotic episodes. A significant number of survivors developed what appears to have been post-viral illness, prolonged fatigue, weakness, and malaise that could last for months, strikingly similar to what later generations would call long COVID. But the most Profound mark the pandemic left on survivors was psychological. The experience of watching dozens or hundreds of people die in a matter of weeks, of losing family members with terrifying suddenness, of living in a world that had been transformed overnight into a place of fear and uncertainty and death. This experience inevitably shaped people's relationship with the world around them. And yet, and this is one of the most psychologically fascinating aspects of the 1918 flu's legacy, the survivors mostly did not talk about it. Not in the way that World War I veterans talked about the trenches, not in the way that Holocaust survivors would eventually talk about the camps, not in the way that Americans later talked about Pearl Harbor or September 11th. They went home. They went back to work. They buried their dead and they kept going. This silence has puzzled historians. Was it psychological self-protection, a deliberate suppression of memories too painful to examine? Was it the context of the war, whose drama and political significance overshadowed the pandemic? Was it something specific to the nature of epidemic disease? Unlike war, it had no enemy to hate, no cause to celebrate, no heroes whose sacrifice gave it meaning. The flu simply was a natural event, impersonal and merciless, offering no narrative satisfactions, no clear lessons about courage or justice, or the human spirit. Whatever the reason, the silence was real and consequential. The generation that lived through 1918 mostly did not write memoirs about the flu. They mostly did not talk about it with their children or grandchildren. When historians in the late 20th century began to research the pandemic seriously, they often found that family memories were fragmentary or entirely absent. Grandchildren knew that a great-grandparent had died during the flu, but often could not say more than that. The silence meant that the lessons of 1918 were not transmitted across generations with the clarity and weight that they deserved. When the next great pandemic challenge came, communities had to rediscover, often painfully, the same truths that the survivors of 1918 had known. That mass gatherings spread disease, that early action saves lives, that clear and honest public communication is essential, that the socially marginalized die disproportionately, that the strongest, most trusted institutions of a society matter enormously in a crisis. Part 6. The War, the Peace, and the President's Collapse. The flu at the front. How disease shaped the war's end. By the late summer of 1918, the war on the Western Front was clearly going badly for Germany. The American soldiers pouring across the Atlantic in their hundreds of thousands were tipping the balance of forces decisively. German morale was crumbling. The German military leadership, including General Erich Ludendorff, was making desperate calculations, trying to determine whether any strategic option remained that could avert defeat. And into this already desperate situation came the flu. Ludendorff's diary and memoirs record his horror at the epidemic sweeping through his troops. In his account, influenza incapacitated enough German soldiers that it materially affected the army's capacity to maintain its defensive positions and respond to Allied offensives. He described watching divisions that should have been at fighting strength reduced to partial effectiveness by illness. He raged that his men were weak and without endurance, and he was careful to blame the flu rather than any failure of leadership or strategy, which was convenient for his reputation, but also reflected the genuine reality that his army was being devastated by disease. The German army was not alone in suffering. Allied forces, French, British, American, were also hit hard by the flu in the summer and fall of 1918. The American Expeditionary Forces under General John Pershing lost tens of thousands of men to illness during the critical autumn offensives. American military deaths from influenza and pneumonia during the war totaled approximately 45,000, roughly as many as the 60,000 Americans killed in direct combat. Some units arrived at the front having lost a significant fraction of their fighting strength to illness during the voyage across the Atlantic. But the crucial difference was that the Allied forces were winning even at reduced strength. Germany was losing even at full strength. The flu hurt both sides, but it hurt the losing side, Germany, more fatally, because Germany had no margin. Every German soldier incapacitated by illness was a soldier whose absence made the already deteriorating defensive line thinner and more vulnerable. Every Allied soldier incapacitated by illness was still one of the millions pouring across the Atlantic, soldiers whose country had virtually unlimited industrial and manpower reserves compared to Germany's exhausted pool. Whether the flu actually determined the war's outcome is debated. The war would probably have ended in Allied victory in any case. The spring 1918 German offensive, which had been the last real German hope, had failed to achieve its objectives before American forces arrived in sufficient numbers. But the flu may have accelerated the end, may have contributed to the speed of Germany's collapse in the autumn of 1918, and may have played some role in the timing and circumstances of the armistice that ended the fighting on November 11th, 1918. The armistice celebration created its own public health disaster. When the news reached American cities on the morning of November 11th, people poured into the streets in their millions. In New York, in Chicago, in San Francisco, in hundreds of smaller cities and towns. They waved flags and cheered and embraced strangers and kissed them and did everything that public health authorities had been desperately trying to prevent for weeks. The flu, which had been subsiding slightly in some cities, resurged in the weeks following the armistice celebrations. The joy of peace had its own terrible price. Paris, 1919, the President falls. In December 1918 and January 1919, the world's leaders gathered in Paris for the peace conference that would determine the shape of the post-war world. Woodrow Wilson arrived with what was perhaps the most ambitious peace plan in the history of diplomacy. His 14 points, a program for remaking the international order on principles of national self-determination, open diplomacy, freedom of the seas, and, most ambitiously, a League of Nations that would provide collective security against future wars. Wilson's plan had significant support among ordinary people in Europe, who were desperate for a lasting peace. But it faced intense opposition from the other Allied leaders, particularly France's Georges Clemenceau and Britain's David Lloyd George, who had their own national interest to protect and who had made promises to their voters that involved rather less idealism and rather more practical advantage than Wilson's 14 points contemplated. The negotiations were grueling. Wilson was in an immensely difficult position, trying to advocate for his vision of a just peace while simultaneously being constrained by the political realities of the Senate back home, which would need to ratify any treaty, and by the determination of his Allied counterparts to extract maximum advantage from Germany's defeat. He was under enormous stress, working long hours in the cold and rain of a Parisian spring that had not yet fully arrived. And then, on the night of April 3rd, 1919, Wilson collapsed. He was in the middle of critical negotiations over the most contentious issues of the peace settlement: the question of reparations, the question of German territory, the question of what would happen to Germany's colonies. His physician, Dr. Cary Grayson, was summoned urgently. Wilson was feverish, vomiting, suffering from violent coughing spasms. Grayson believed he had contracted influenza. The third wave of the pandemic was still circulating in Paris in the spring of 1919. What happened to Wilson in the days that followed is one of the great medical mysteries of modern political history. Those who were with him in Paris, including his closest advisors, described a dramatic and disturbing change in his behavior and cognitive function. Herbert Hoover, who was in Paris at the time, later wrote that Wilson seemed suddenly unable to focus, that he became confused about details he had previously had firmly in hand, that he made concessions he should not have made with an almost desperate eagerness to end the negotiations. Hoover was shocked by the change. Other observers noted that Wilson became uncharacteristically passive. willing to accept terms he had previously rejected, almost as if his will to fight had been drained away. Some historians believe that Wilson's illness at Paris was a small stroke, that the influenza he contracted weakened him in ways that made him vulnerable to the cerebrovascular event that his progressive arteriosclerosis had been building toward. Wilson would suffer a much larger, more obviously incapacitating stroke in October 1919 while campaigning across the country for the League of Nations. Others believe that the flu itself, in its more severe neurological manifestations, caused enough direct damage to Wilson's brain function to impair his judgment and decision-making for the crucial final weeks of the peace negotiations. Whatever the precise medical cause, the political consequences were significant. In the weeks after his illness, Wilson made a series of concessions to Clemenceau's demands for a harsh peace with Germany. Concessions that his own advisors believed were mistakes, that violated the spirit of his 14 points, and that planted some of the seeds of the resentment and instability that would eventually contribute to the rise of Hitler and the Second World War. The brutal reparations regime imposed on Germany, the humiliating war guilt clause that blamed the war solely on Germany, the territorial arrangements that created new grievances rather than resolving old ones, these features of the Treaty of Versailles, which Wilson's earlier vision had been designed to prevent, emerged in part from the negotiations during and after Wilson's illness. It would be far too simple to say that the flu caused World War II. The connections are indirect, contingent on many other factors, and the counterfactual, what the peace settlement would have looked like if Wilson had remained healthy, is necessarily speculative. But it is not unreasonable to suggest that the 1918 flu pandemic, which had already killed hundreds of thousands of Americans and tens of millions of people worldwide, may have also contributed, through its effect on the most powerful man at the Paris Peace Conference, to shaping a peace settlement that planted the seeds of another catastrophe. Part 7. The World After the Plague. The Third Wave and the Long Goodbye. The 1918 flu did not end with the armistice or with the Paris Peace Conference. A third wave struck in the winter and spring of 1919, less devastating than the second wave, but still lethal enough to kill tens of thousands more Americans and many more hundreds of thousands worldwide. This third wave extended into the summer of 1919 before the pandemic finally began to subside. The reason the pandemic eventually ended is a matter of some scientific debate. The most important factor was almost certainly the development of population-level immunity. As more and more people were infected and either died or survived, with survivors developing immune memory that protected them from the same strain, the proportion of the population that remained fully susceptible to the virus declined. When this proportion fell below a certain threshold, what epidemiologists call the herd immunity threshold, the virus could no longer find enough new hosts to sustain exponential spread. Cases declined, the pandemic receded, but herd immunity was a brutal way to end a pandemic. It required the infection and death or survival of a huge fraction of the population to achieve. Estimates suggest that roughly a third of the world's population, about 500 million people out of a global population of approximately 1.8 billion, was infected during the 1918 to 1919 pandemic. The death toll is estimated at a minimum of 50 million people worldwide, and some credible estimates run as high as 100 million. In proportional terms, relative to the global population of the time, this was a death toll that dwarfs almost every other disaster in human history. In America, the end of the pandemic in the summer of 1919 was greeted not with ceremonies of commemoration, but with an almost desperate eagerness to return to normal. The economy, which had been severely disrupted by the closures and illness of the pandemic months, needed rebuilding. The soldiers were coming home from Europe and needed jobs. The factories that had been making war materials needed to convert to peacetime production. Life was waiting to be lived, and the generation that had survived both the war and the plague was determined to live it. The Roaring Twenties, with their jazz and their flappers and their speakeasies and their dizzying economic growth, can be understood in part as a collective psychological response to the traumas of 1917 to 1919, a generation that had survived the worst and was determined to enjoy the best. The wild energy of the 20s, the rejection of Victorian propriety, the celebration of youth and modernity and pleasure, may owe something to the raw animal relief of people who had genuinely looked death in the face and come through. The forgotten pandemic. Why did America forget? Among the questions that historians of the 1918 flu have asked, perhaps the most interesting is, why did America forget? How was it possible for a catastrophe that killed 675,000 Americans, more than World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War combined, to fade from public memory so quickly and so thoroughly? Alfred Crosby, whose 1989 book America's Forgotten Pandemic is one of the foundational texts of 1918 flu scholarship, wrestled extensively with this question. His conclusion was multifaceted. Part of the answer, he argued, was the speed with which the pandemic ended. Unlike a war, which has a clear beginning and end, a build-up of tension, a cast of human actors engaged in human drama, the flu simply arrived, killed for a few months, and left. It had no memorable battles, no heroic generals, no famous victories. It could not be turned into a narrative of human courage and sacrifice in the way that war could, because its victims did not die for a cause or in pursuit of a goal. They simply died by the millions of disease. Part of the answer was the shame associated with the government's failure, the Wilson administration's decision to suppress information about the pandemic, to continue public events in the face of spreading disease, to use censorship laws to silence doctors and newspapers. These decisions had contributed directly to tens of thousands of unnecessary deaths. Acknowledging the pandemic fully would have meant acknowledging these failures, and in the immediate aftermath of the war, which the United States had won, the national mood was not suited to that kind of honest reckoning. Part of the answer was the scale of the trauma itself. The pandemic was so widespread, so rapid, so universal in its impact, that it left almost no community or family untouched. When everyone has suffered, when loss is universal rather than particular, it can actually be harder to process and commemorate. There is no community that was spared enough to stand apart and mourn the communities that were devastated. Everyone is mourning. Everyone is also trying to survive. And there is a limit to how much trauma a society can publicly acknowledge and process simultaneously. And part of the answer, perhaps the most interesting part, was that the flu's victims were not remembered as heroes or martyrs in the way that war's victims were. The soldiers who died in France died for something, or so the national mythology insisted. Their deaths had meaning, had valor, had purpose. The people who died of flu in Philadelphia, tenements, or Alaskan villages, or army camps in Kansas simply died. Randomly, impersonally, without any choice or agency or sacrifice. And in a culture that valued agency and sacrifice, that found it difficult to assign meaning to purely random tragedy, such deaths were harder to commemorate. This is not a universal human response. Many cultures around the world have developed rich traditions for commemorating epidemic death. Rituals, memorials, annual observances that keep the memory of plague alive across generations. Medieval European communities that survived the Black Death often marked the anniversary of the plague's arrival in their town for centuries afterward. But the United States in 1919 had no such tradition, and it did not develop one. The flu was buried with its dead. The legacy in science. What the 1918 flu taught medicine. If the social memory of the 1918 flu was largely suppressed, its scientific legacy was profound and lasting. The pandemic drove advances in virology, epidemiology, and public health that shaped the practice of medicine throughout the 20th century. The most immediate practical consequence was the renewed impetus for influenza vaccine development. Scientists who had spent years trying to develop vaccines against bacterial infections turned their attention to the flu virus, a more technically challenging target since viruses could not be grown in the same ways that bacteria could. The first effective influenza vaccines were developed in the 1930s and 1940s, and the annual flu vaccine that most Americans are familiar with today, a product that needs to be updated every year because the influenza virus mutates so rapidly, is a direct descendant of the research programs that were launched in the aftermath of the 1918 pandemic. The development of antiviral drugs, compounds specifically designed to interfere with viral replication, owed a great deal to the understanding of influenza's molecular biology that accumulated in the decades following 1918. The modern antiviral drugs used to treat flu, such as oseltamivir, Tamiflu, work by blocking a key enzyme on the surface of the influenza virus, an enzyme whose structure was first characterized using the genetic sequences recovered from 1918 flu victims' preserved tissues. The 1918 pandemic also drove the development of modern epidemiology, the science of how diseases spread through populations and how to control their spread. The careful analysis of what had happened in different American cities during the pandemic, why St. Louis had done so much better than Philadelphia, why cities that acted early had consistently lower death tolls than cities that acted late, provided some of the foundational evidence for public health interventions that are now standard practice: closing schools, banning large gatherings, quarantining cases, promoting hygiene. The concept of non-pharmaceutical interventions, the toolkit of measures that can be deployed before a vaccine is available, was largely developed from the lessons of 1918 and the reconstruction of the 1918 virus's genetic sequence by Taubenberger and his colleagues in the late 1990s and early 2000s provided a scientific windfall of incalculable value. By understanding precisely what genetic features made the 1918 virus so deadly, scientists gained crucial insights into what to watch for in newly emerging flu strains. Knowledge that directly informs the global influenza surveillance systems that monitor novel flu viruses in animal populations around the world today, watching for the genetic combinations that would signal the emergence of a new pandemic strain. Part 8. The numbers that still stagger the mind. What the statistics actually mean. The statistics of the 1918 flu pandemic are so large that they can become abstract, mere numbers, too vast to carry emotional weight. But each number represents a life, a family, a community shaped forever by a specific absence. It is worth pausing to let the numbers be specific and concrete. In the United States, the pandemic killed 675,000 people. This is a number that exceeds the combined American death toll from World War I, approximately 53,000 combat deaths. World War II, approximately 291,000 combat deaths. The Korean War, approximately 33,000 combat deaths. And the Vietnam War, approximately 58,000 combat deaths. Adding those wars together gives approximately 435,000 deaths, still well short of the flu's 675,000. In October 1918 alone, the single deadliest month, the pandemic killed 195,000 Americans. This is more Americans than were killed in the entire Vietnam War. The average life expectancy in the United States dropped by 12 years between 1917 and 1918, from 51 years to 39 years, because of the pandemic. This is one of the most dramatic single-year demographic changes in American history. Globally, estimates of the pandemic's death toll range from 50 million to 100 million people. The world's population at the time was approximately 1.8 billion, So the pandemic killed somewhere between 2.7 and 5.5% of all the people then alive on Earth. By comparison, World War I killed approximately 17 million people, less than a third of the flu's lowest estimate. Approximately 500 million people, roughly one-third of the world's entire population, were infected with the virus during the pandemic. 1 in every 3 people on Earth caught it. And of those who caught it, the case fatality rate, the fraction who died, was somewhere between 2 and 3%. This compares to a case fatality rate for ordinary seasonal flu of well under 0.1%, making the 1918 strain roughly 20 to 30 times more deadly than a normal flu season. In some populations, the death rates were catastrophically higher. Brevig Mission, Alaska, lost 85% of its population in a week. Some indigenous Alaskan villages lost their entire adult population. Western Samoa, in the Pacific, lost 22% of its total population, nearly 1 in 4 people in 2 months. The Navajo Nation, in the American Southwest, experienced mortality rates estimated at 4 times the national average, with some communities losing a quarter or more of their members. The pandemic killed more people in a single year than the Black Death killed in Europe in any single year of its 14th century run. It killed more people in a single year than any other disease outbreak in recorded human history, with the possible exception of smallpox and malaria over their much longer periods of activity. These numbers are not just historical curiosities. They are a measure of what humanity's vulnerability to novel pathogens actually looks like. What happens when a virus with the right combination of transmissibility and lethality encounters a population with no immunity. They are a reminder of the stakes involved in pandemic preparedness and response, a reminder that the decisions made by governments and public health officials at the beginning of a pandemic can determine the fate of hundreds of thousands or millions of people. And Part 9, the famous and the forgotten. Those who died and those who survived. The 1918 flu pandemic is unusual among the great catastrophes of history in that it killed relatively few famous people. Most of the political and cultural leaders of the era survived. Woodrow Wilson recovered from his Paris illness and went on to suffer his debilitating stroke later that same year. Winston Churchill survived. Franklin Delano Roosevelt contracted the flu while in Europe in 1918 and survived. David Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, caught a severe case but recovered. King Alfonso XIII of Spain, whose illness had helped give the pandemic its name, recovered. Among the famous who did die, the legendary Apache warrior Geronimo's daughter, Lena. The pioneering German sociologist Max Weber, who was not killed by the flu, but whose health was seriously weakened by his 1918 illness in ways that may have contributed to his death in 1920. The American painter of exquisite social observation, John Singer Sargent, contracted the flu, but survived and went on to paint one of the most striking artistic responses to the pandemic, his haunting 1919 canvas, Gassed, which depicts soldiers blinded by mustard gas, but which some art historians have read as a response to the dual traumas of war and epidemic. Perhaps the most artistically significant survivor was Edvard Munch, the great Norwegian expressionist painter most famous for The Scream. Munch contracted the flu in 1919 and survived, and he painted 2 self-portraits of his experience. Self-portrait with the Spanish flu and self-portrait after the Spanish flu that are among the most extraordinary first-person visual testimonies to the pandemic's physical and psychological impact. In the first painting, Munch appears haggard, pale, sunken-eyed, slumped in a chair with the particular exhaustion of serious illness. In the second, he appears more recovered but shaken, aged in ways that have little to do with the mere passage of weeks. The paintings are not famous in the way that The Scream is famous, but they are deeply affecting, a great artist's unflinching record of his own encounter with death. Franz Kafka, the Czech-German writer whose work would become canonical, in the 20th century, contracted the flu in October 1918. He was already suffering from tuberculosis, and the flu complicated his already precarious health significantly. He survived the flu, but his tuberculosis worsened, and he died in 1924. His flu experience may have darkened and deepened the themes of helplessness, bureaucratic indifference, and arbitrary suffering that pervade his later work. Among the genuinely famous who did die of the flu was the American political activist and poet John Reed, author of 10 Days That Shook the World, the celebrated eyewitness account of the Bolshevik Revolution. Reed died in Moscow in 1920, his health broken by a combination of typhus and influenza. His death at 33 cut short one of the most remarkable journalistic careers in American history. The thousands of less famous people who died, the factory workers, the farmers, the soldiers, the nurses, the children, the immigrants, in tenement apartments, the Alaska Native elders whose deaths severed communities from their own knowledge and traditions, are remembered, if at all, in family stories and local historical records. Most of them are not remembered at all. They lived, they were loved, they died, and then the survivors moved on, as survivors must, and the memories faded. Part 10. The Long Shadow. The Flu That Would Not Die. One of the most extraordinary facts about the 1918 influenza pandemic, one that is not widely known outside the scientific community, is that the virus did not simply disappear. It mutated and evolved over the decades that followed, but its genetic descendants are still circulating in human populations today. Every seasonal flu season, the influenza viruses that make people sick around the world are, in a genetic sense, the great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren of the 1918 pandemic strain. They have changed enormously over the course of a century, mutated, reassorted with other influenza strains, evolved in response to the immune pressures imposed by human vaccination and natural infection. But traces of the 1918 virus's genetic signature remain detectable in the flu viruses of the 21st century. This is not merely a scientific curiosity. It is a reminder that the 1918 pandemic did not have a clear, definitive end. It simply transformed gradually from an acute catastrophe into a chronic part of the human disease burden. The estimated 36,000 Americans who die from flu-related causes in an average year, the toll of a normal flu season, are in some meaningful sense dying from a disease that traces its current form back to the virus that emerged in 1918. The accumulated death toll of ordinary flu in the century since 1918 amounts to millions of people. A rolling tribute to a virus that began its career in a Kansas county and went on to circle the globe. The 2009 H1N1 pandemic, the swine flu pandemic that caused significant alarm before proving less deadly than initially feared, was itself partly a product of the 1918 virus's legacy. The 2009 pandemic strain was a complex genetic mosaic that included elements derived via various evolutionary paths from the 1918 pandemic virus. Scientists who compared the genetic sequences found striking similarities, enough to suggest that the 2009 pandemic was, in a very real biological sense, a descendant of the 1918 event. And the children and grandchildren of 1918 survivors carry, in some cases, antibodies and immune memory that reflect their ancestors' exposure to the original pandemic strain. A biological legacy written not in history books, but in the molecular memory of the human immune system. The questions that remain. Century after the 1918 pandemic, there are still questions that have not been fully answered, mysteries that continue to occupy historians, scientists, and public health officials. The most fundamental question, where did the 1918 virus actually come from, remains, in a strict scientific sense, incompletely resolved. The Haskell County, Kansas origin theory is compelling and widely accepted, but it is not definitively proven. Some researchers have argued for European origins, pointing to evidence of unusual respiratory illness in British soldiers in France as early as 1916. Others have suggested Chinese origins, pointing to unusual outbreaks of respiratory disease in China in 1917 and 1918, and to the fact that large numbers of Chinese laborers were working in France near Allied military camps. The genetic evidence from the reconstructed 1918 virus does not definitively settle the question, because the evolutionary history of influenza is complex enough that the same genetic sequence could have multiple possible origins. The question of exactly how many people the pandemic killed, while seemingly a matter of record-keeping, also remains genuinely uncertain. The estimate of 100 million worldwide reflects a wide range of uncertainty because many regions of the world in 1918, particularly in Africa, South Asia, and parts of Asia, had no systematic death registration system, and the flu deaths in these regions can only be estimated from fragmentary historical records and demographic analysis. It is possible that the actual death toll was significantly higher than the conventional estimates suggest. The question of what exactly made the 1918 strain so uniquely lethal, while substantially answered by the molecular analysis of the reconstructed virus, is still not completely resolved. Scientists understand the broad mechanisms: the cytokine storm, the affinity for the lower respiratory tract, the lack of human immune memory. But there are still specific molecular features of the 1918 virus whose contribution to its extraordinary lethality is not fully understood, and the question of whether and when a similar pandemic might emerge again is perhaps the most practically important unanswered question. Scientists who study pandemic influenza agree that the emergence of another pandemic strain is not a matter of if, but when. The conditions that gave rise to the 1918 pandemic, the existence of animal reservoirs of influenza virus that can exchange genetic material with human flu strains, the constant evolutionary pressure on the virus to find new ways to infect and spread, the global connectivity of the modern world that allows any novel pathogen to reach every inhabited continent within days rather than months. These conditions are, if anything, more favorable for pandemic emergence today than they were in 1918. The difference, scientists hope, is that we are better prepared. The global influenza surveillance network that monitors viral evolution in animal and human populations, looking for the genetic combinations that would signal pandemic potential, is a direct legacy of the lessons learned from 1918. The vaccine, manufacturing infrastructure that can be rapidly redirected to produce pandemic-specific vaccines, and, in the 21st century, the mRNA vaccine technology that can compress vaccine development timelines from years to months, is a product of a century of research stimulated in large part by the need to understand and prevent what happened in 1918. The public health systems, the international coordination mechanisms, the stockpiles of antiviral drugs, all of these represent investments in pandemic preparedness that were not available in 1918. Whether they are adequate, whether the world is prepared enough for the next pandemic, is a question that those who study public health answer with varying degrees of confidence. The 2020 COVID-19 pandemic provided a sobering demonstration that even in the 21st century, with all of humanity's accumulated scientific knowledge and technological capacity, a novel respiratory virus could kill millions of people, overwhelm healthcare systems, disrupt economies, and trigger exactly the kinds of political conflicts over masks, gatherings, and government authority that had played out more than a century Earlier in San Francisco's Dreamland Rink, the parallels between 1918 and 2020 were not lost on historians and public health experts who watched the second pandemic unfold. The debates about mask mandates, the political pressures on public health authorities, the tension between economic activity and pandemic control, the unequal burden on marginalized communities, the critical importance of clear and honest government, communication, the life-saving effect of early and decisive action. All of these were recognizable to anyone who knew the history of 1918. The lessons were there, written in blood, waiting to be applied. Epilogue. The names we should remember. The debt we owe. There is a cross in the ground at Brevig Mission, Alaska, above a mass grave that holds 72 souls. The grave has been disturbed twice, once in 1951, once in 1997, by scientists seeking the genetic blueprint of a killer. The village has rebuilt itself, the population has recovered, the language is still spoken, but the knowledge of the 72 who lie beneath the permafrost is part of what made it possible for scientists, nearly 80 years after their deaths, to understand the disease that killed them. There is a plaque at Midcoast Hospital in Bath, Maine, honoring 3 young volunteer nurses, Harriet Bliss, Alice Dane, and Adelaide Hogue, who died of flu they contracted while caring for strangers. Harriet was 28, Alice was 29, Adelaide was 34. Their names would have been entirely forgotten, but for this small piece of metal on a hospital wall. There is a stretch of 23 city blocks in Philadelphia that on September 28, 1918, was lined with hundreds of thousands of people celebrating the sale of war bonds while a virus killed them. The people who walked those blocks mostly do not have names in the historical record. They were ordinary Americans, working people, immigrants, mothers with children on their shoulders, men who had not been drafted because they were too old or too young or too indispensable at home. They were not doing anything wrong. They were being American, patriotic, communal, gathered together in one of the fundamental human acts of civic participation. They were killed for it by a government that chose a parade over their lives. There are the 675,000 graves scattered across the United States, in city cemeteries and country churchyards, in veterans' cemeteries and potters' fields, marked by proper stones and by no markers at all. There are the family stories half remembered across 5 or 6 generations. Great-grandma died in the flu. And the photographs of young faces that no one still living can identify. There are the children who grew up without parents, shaped by that absence in ways they may not have fully understood, carrying the pandemic's legacy forward in ways that were not explicitly remembered, but were nonetheless real. And there are the lessons, hard-won, paid for in lives, and too often forgotten. The lesson that an infectious disease cannot be managed by pretending it does not exist. The lesson that a government's first duty in a public health crisis is honest communication, not reassurance, not optimism, not the suppression of information that might cause panic, but the kind of clear, accurate information that allows citizens to make rational decisions about their own safety and the safety of their communities. The lesson that early action saves lives, that the cost of closing schools or cancelling parades or quarantining infected people is small compared to the cost of the deaths that would otherwise occur. The lesson that the poor and the marginalized die first and worst in a pandemic, and that a society's commitment to its most vulnerable members is tested most severely in exactly these moments of collective crisis. These lessons were written in 1918. Some of them were partially learned. Some of them were forgotten and had to be relearned painfully in subsequent crises. Some of them are still not fully applied. The 675,000 Americans who died of the Spanish flu in 1918 and 1919 are owed, at a minimum, the honor of being remembered. They are owed the acknowledgement that their deaths were not inevitable, that different choices made by different people might have saved many of them. They are owed our commitment to learning from their experience so that when the next pandemic comes, as it will come, as it has always come, we are better prepared than the generation of 1918 was to face it. The children jumping rope in the autumn of 1918, chanting about a little bird named Enza. I opened the window, and in flew Enza. Did not know what was behind them, or ahead of them, or sweeping through the apartment buildings and barracks and hospitals of their world. They were just children, playing. And the best memorial we can offer to the millions who died is not a monument or a holiday, but the serious, sustained effort to understand what happened and to ensure that it never happens quite that way again. The 1918 Spanish flu pandemic remains, by most measures, the single most catastrophic acute public health event in modern history. It infected an estimated 500 million people worldwide, 1/3 of the global population, and killed between 50 and 100 million of them. In the United States, it killed 675,000 people in approximately 18 months. The pandemic fundamentally shaped the science of virology, the practice of public health, the politics of the Wilson era, and the social landscape of the early 20th century. Its descendants, the H1N1 influenza viruses that still circulate today, are a biological legacy that connects the world of 2026 directly to a Kansas farmhouse in the winter of 1918. The virus is gone in its original form. The lessons it taught are permanent, if we choose to remember them.